Have you ever looked into a dog's eyes and realized he knew a terrifying secret that you didn't? When a heavily scarred, wheelchair-bound Navy SEAL rolled into a Seattle emergency room bleeding profusely, the medical staff thought they were just treating another late-night trauma. But he wasn't alone. By his side was a massive, battle-hardened K9 German Shepherd, whose presence alone sent shivers down the spine of everyone in the room. What started as a simple plea for help, "Can you help me?" quickly spiraled into a life-or-death standoff, because the dog didn't just stand guard. He froze the entire ER, exposing a deadly threat right under the doctor's noses. You won't believe who he was growling at. The fluorescent lights of Seattle General Hospital's emergency department flickered with a maddening irregularity that always seemed worse during the graveyard shift. It was 2:14 a.m. on a Tuesday, and a relentless Pacific Northwest downpour was hammering against the reinforced glass doors. Inside, the ER was a chaotic symphony of ringing phones, beeping cardiac monitors, and the low, urgent murmurs of medical staff. Isabella Jenkins wiped a stray strand of blonde hair from her forehead, her scrubs already stained with iodine and coffee. It was only her third week as a registered trauma nurse at Seattle General, but at 28, she had spent the previous 4 years working in a high-volume inner-city clinic in Chicago. She was no stranger to blood, panic, or the unpredictable nature of desperate people. Yet, nothing in her training or experience could have prepared her for the moment the automatic sliding doors hissed open, letting in a gust of freezing rain and an imposing, unforgettable duo. The man was in a battered, manual wheelchair. He looked to be in his late 40s, his face a roadmap of pale, jagged scars that spoke of violent, untold histories. He wore a heavy, dark green military surplus canvas jacket, darkened further by what Isabella's trained eyes immediately recognized as a massive amount of fresh blood soaking through the right side of his abdomen. His posture was rigid, his jaw clenched so tightly the muscles fluttered beneath his skin. But it wasn't just the man that brought the bustling triage area to a sudden, absolute standstill. Pacing perfectly at the left wheel of his chair was a German Shepherd. This wasn't a standard pet. The dog was massive, easily weighing over 90 pounds with a sleek, rain-slicked coat of deep black and rich mahogany. He wore a heavy-duty tactical harness fitted with subdued, Velcro-backed patches. The K9's amber eyes were sharply intelligent, scanning the brightly lit room with a predatory calculation that made the hair on the back of Isabella's neck stand up. The dog made no sound, no panting, no whining, no nails clicking wildly on the linoleum. He moved with the silent, disciplined grace of a seasoned soldier. Brenda, the veteran triage nurse sitting behind the reinforced glass counter, stood up, her eyes wide. "Sir, you can't have a dog in here," she called out, her voice faltering slightly as the shepherd's amber gaze briefly flicked toward her. The man in the wheelchair didn't look at Brenda. His dark, sunken eyes locked onto Isabella, who was standing beside a gurney holding a stack of clean linens. His chest heaved with a ragged, wet breath. His hand, shaking violently despite his obvious attempts to control it, gripped the armrest of his chair. "Can you help me?" His voice rasped. It was barely above a whisper, gravelly and strained, thick with the kind of pain that would have rendered an ordinary man unconscious hours ago. Isabella dropped the linens. She didn't care about hospital protocols regarding animals right now. The pallor of the man's skin and the terrifying rate at which dark blood was pooling onto the rubber mat beneath his chair told her he had minutes, maybe less, before going into severe hypovolemic shock. "Brenda, page Dr. Miller to Trauma Bay 3. Now," Isabella shouted, instantly closing the distance between herself and the man. As she approached, the German Shepherd stepped forward, placing himself perfectly between Isabella and the wheelchair. The dog didn't growl, but his posture stiffened, his ears pinning back just a fraction. He was establishing a perimeter. Isabella stopped, raising her hands slowly, palms open. She looked at the man. "My name is Isabella. I'm a nurse. I need to get you onto a bed and stop that bleeding. But your partner here needs to let me pass." The man swallowed hard, a sheen of cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. He reached out a trembling, blood-stained hand and lightly touched the dog's head. "Stand down, Bruno," the man whispered. Instantly, the tension in the massive dog's body vanished. Bruno stepped back, sitting perfectly flush against the wheel of the chair, his eyes never leaving Isabella's face but permitting her entry into their space. "Okay, Isabella breathed, stepping forward and gripping the handles of the wheelchair. "I've got you." "What's your name, sir?" "Arthur," he grunted, wincing as Isabella maneuvered the chair toward the trauma bays. "Arthur Pendleton, retired Navy." "All right, Arthur. We're going to take care of you." "How did this happen?" Isabella asked, pushing the chair rapidly down the hallway. Arthur's head rolled slightly to the side, his eyes momentarily losing focus before snapping back to reality with frightening intensity. "It was an accident. I slipped on some rebar at a construction site near the docks." Isabella frowned, glancing down at the wound as they entered Trauma Bay 3. The placement, the volume of blood, the neat, circular tear in the canvas jacket. It didn't look like a puncture from falling on rebar. But right now, stopping the bleed was the only priority. "Up on the bed, Arthur," Isabella said, locking the wheels. She hit the call button on the wall. "I need orderlies in Bay 3 for a lift assist." "No," Arthur gritted out. "No lifting." Before Isabella could stop him, Arthur planted his left foot on the ground. With a sudden explosive burst of agonizing effort, he launched his upper body out of the chair, essentially throwing himself onto the hospital bed. A sharp cry of pain escaped his lips as he landed, clutching his side. Bruno was instantly on his hind legs, his front paws resting lightly on the edge of the mattress, his wet nose pressing gently against Arthur's cheek. Arthur weakly patted the dog's neck. "I'm okay, buddy. Hold the line." Bruno immediately dropped to all fours and retreated exactly 3 feet from the bed, sitting squarely in the corner of the trauma bay, his amber eyes watching the doorway like a sentinel. The curtain to Trauma Bay 3 was roughly yanked aside, and Dr. Harrison Miller stormed into the room. Dr. Miller was a brilliant trauma surgeon, but he possessed the bedside manner of a cornered rattlesnake. He was notoriously strict about hospital policy and detested anything that interrupted the sterile, controlled environment of his ER. "What do we have, Jenkins?" Miller barked, snapping on a pair of blue nitrile gloves as he approached the bed. He stopped dead in his tracks, his eyes darting to the corner of the room. "What the hell is that doing in my ER?" "Dr. Miller, this is Arthur Pendleton. Severe abdominal trauma," Isabella said quickly, trying to steer the doctor's attention back to the bleeding man. "And this is his service animal, Bruno. I don't care if it's the mayor's service animal. Get that beast out of here." "Infection control protocol," Miller snapped, pointing a gloved finger at the door. "Security. Get security down here." Arthur, who had been lying back with his eyes closed, suddenly reached out and clamped a bloody hand around Dr. Miller's wrist with astonishing, vice-like strength. The doctor gasped, trying to pull away, but the disabled man's grip was unyielding. "Bruno stays," Arthur said softly. The tone wasn't a request. It was a chilling, absolute statement of fact. "He is federally protected. Try to remove him, and I walk out of here. Or bleed out here. Your choice, Doc." In the corner, Bruno didn't move, but a low, vibrating rumble originated deep in his chest. It wasn't a full growl, but the acoustic warning was enough to make Dr. Miller pale. "Fine," Miller hissed, ripping his arm out of Arthur's grasp. "But if that mutt gets in my way, I'm calling animal control. Jenkins, cut that jacket off him. Let's see this rebar wound." Isabella grabbed a pair of trauma shears and carefully sliced up the heavy canvas and the blood-soaked cotton shirt underneath. As the fabric fell away, exposing Arthur's heavily scarred torso, Isabella gasped. It was a puncture wound, located in the lower right quadrant of his abdomen, but there were no jagged edges, no tearing of the skin typical of falling onto rusty construction debris. It was a perfectly round, clean hole, surrounded by a ring of dark, stippled bruising powder burns. "Doctor," Isabella whispered, looking up at Miller. "I see it," Miller said tightly, his arrogant demeanor evaporating into clinical focus. He leaned over Arthur. "Mr. Pendleton, you didn't fall on rebar. You've been shot." At close range, Arthur stared at the ceiling, his jaw set. He didn't confirm or deny it. "Jenkins, get 2 large-bore IVs in his arms. Push fluids wide open, and get O-negative blood down here now. Call the police. Tell them we have a GSW," Miller ordered rapidly. "Sir, we have to contact law enforcement. That's mandatory. Do what you have to do," Arthur whispered, closing his eyes as a wave of pain washed over him. "Just patch me up." As Isabella worked quickly, inserting the IV needles and hooking up the saline. She couldn't help but study Arthur. His torso was a map of old trauma, shrapnel scars, older bullet wounds, surgical incisions. He had been a Navy SEAL, that much he had admitted. But the fresh wound was baffling. Who shoots a disabled veteran in a wheelchair at 2 in the morning down by the Seattle docks? Pressure is dropping, Isabella noted, looking at the monitor. 90/60. Heart rate 115. We need to pack the wound and get him to a CT scan to see where that bullet is lodged, Miller said, grabbing a handful of sterile gauze. He pressed it hard into the entry wound. Arthur's body arched off the bed with a muffled groan. But he didn't scream. Isabella glanced over at Bruno, expecting the dog to react to his handler's pain. But the German shepherd wasn't looking at Arthur anymore. Bruno had stood up. The dog had taken one silent step forward, moving out of the corner. His body language had completely changed. The relaxed, disciplined posture was gone. Every muscle in the K9's massive frame was suddenly coiled, taut like a wire about to snap. His ears were swiveled forward, acting like radar dishes, and his amber eyes were locked intensely on the gap in the privacy curtain that led out to the main ER floor. Arthur, Isabella said softly, a sudden feeling of unease settling in her stomach. Is Bruno okay? Arthur, despite the agonizing pain of Dr. Miller packing his wound, snapped his eyes open. He looked past Isabella, locking eyes with his dog. Bruno's hackles, the thick strip of fur running down his spine, had raised completely. His tail was stiff, sitting perfectly horizontal. The dog inhaled deeply through his nose, scenting the sterile hospital air. Doc, Arthur rasped, his voice suddenly sharp, commanding. Stop. I have to hold pressure, Mr. Pendleton, Miller started. I said stop, Arthur barked, pushing Miller's hand away. Arthur weakly pushed himself up onto his elbows, wincing, his eyes entirely focused on his K9. Bruno took another step toward the curtain. The dog lowered his head slightly, his lips peeling back just a fraction to reveal gleaming white canines. What is that dog doing? Dr. Miller demanded, taking a nervous step back. I told you, if he becomes aggressive, quiet, Arthur commanded. He looked at Isabella, his dark eyes filled with an urgent, terrifying clarity. Nurse, look outside the curtain. Tell me exactly what you see. Isabella hesitated, but something in Arthur's voice compelled her to obey. It was the voice of a man who had survived nightmares by noticing the things others missed. She stepped slowly to the edge of the curtain and peeked through a small gap, looking out into the brightly lit, chaotic triage floor. I just see the ER, Isabella whispered back, feeling foolish. Brenda is at the desk. There's a guy with a broken arm in chair 2, a mother with a crying baby, and paramedics just rolled a stretcher in through the sliding doors. Describe the stretcher, Arthur whispered, his hand reaching down to the side of his wheelchair, patting the empty pockets of a tactical bag slung over the back. He was looking for a weapon he didn't have. It's 2 paramedics. City fire. They're pushing a guy on a backboard. Looks like a car accident. He's wearing a yellow reflective rain jacket. Heavy boots. The paramedics are talking to Brenda at the desk. Inside the trauma bay, a sound began to fill the small space. It started as a low vibration, so deep Isabella felt it in her chest before she actually heard it. It was Bruno. The K9 was issuing a guttural, primal growl, his eyes fixed dead ahead on the silhouette of the paramedics through the thin fabric of the curtain. Arthur, what is it? Isabella asked, her heart beginning to pound against her ribs. That man on the stretcher, Arthur said, his voice dropping to a dead, icy whisper. Is he wearing a yellow jacket, black boots, with a shaved head and a tribal tattoo on his neck? Isabella looked through the curtain again. The man on the stretcher was sitting up slightly, arguing with the paramedics. The yellow jacket, the boots, and as he turned his head, the stark, black ink of a tribal tattoo snaked up the side of his neck. Isabella felt the blood drain from her face. She turned back to Arthur and simply nodded. Get away from the curtain, Arthur ordered quietly. Now, the transition in the emergency room was profound and instantaneous. One moment, the floor was a bustling hive of medical efficiency phones ringing, intercoms blaring, the relentless beep of telemetry monitors. The next moment, A terrifying anomaly completely derailed the machinery of the hospital. It started when Bruno pushed his way past the privacy curtain of Trauma Bay 3. The massive German Shepherd didn't run. He walked with a slow, deliberate, terrifyingly calculated stalk, stepping out into the middle of the main ER floor. The fluorescent lights caught the raised, stiff bristles of fur along his spine. Dr. Miller, furious and panicked, threw the curtain open. "Security, get that animal out of here right now," he bellowed, but his voice fell flat, echoing strangely in the suddenly quiet room. Officer David Briggs, the hospital's armed security guard, hurried over, his hand resting instinctively on his pepper spray. "Hey, whose dog is this?" he shouted. Bruno ignored the doctor. He ignored the security guard. The highly trained combat K9 walked exactly to the center of the linoleum floor, placing himself directly between the hallway leading to Trauma Bay 3 and the triage desk where the paramedics had just parked their stretcher. Then, Bruno planted his feet. He lowered his massive chest toward the floor, assuming a textbook aggressive guard stance. And he let out a roar. It wasn't a standard dog bark. It was a deafening, explosive sound of pure, unadulterated warning that echoed off the tile walls and struck fear into the heart of every person present. The sound was so commanding, so deeply menacing, that the entire emergency room simply froze. The crying baby shocked into silence. The nurses dropped their clipboards. Officer Briggs froze mid-step, his hand hovering over his belt. Bruno's amber eyes were locked with laser-like precision on the man in the yellow jacket sitting on the stretcher. "Good boy, Bruno." A weak, raspy voice echoed from Trauma Bay 3. Isabella stood in the doorway of the bay, her hands shaking as she wheeled Arthur out slightly so he could see. Arthur was clutching his bleeding side, his face ghostly white, but his eyes were hard as flint. The man on the stretcher, the supposed car crash victim, stared at the dog. For a split second, Isabella saw genuine terror flash in the man's eyes. Then, his demeanor entirely shifted. The hunched, pained posture of a crash victim vanished. He sat up perfectly straight, his face hardening into a cold, ruthless sneer. "Nurse Jenkins," Arthur whispered, not taking his eyes off the man in the yellow jacket. "Back away into the bay. Lock the wheels of my chair." "Arthur, what is happening?" Isabella pleaded, her voice trembling. "That man didn't get into a car crash," Arthur said grimly. "His name is Victor Sullivan, and he's the one who put the bullet in my stomach 45 minutes ago." Isabella's breath hitched in her throat. She looked from Arthur to the man on the stretcher. Victor Sullivan was slowly reaching his right hand beneath the heavy, yellow reflective jacket. "Hey, buddy, you need to lie back down," one of the paramedics said, placing a hand on Victor's shoulder, completely oblivious to the lethal standoff unfolding around him. "Get your hands off me," Victor snapped, shoving the paramedic backward with enough force to send him crashing into the triage counter. Officer Briggs finally reacted, drawing his taser and aiming it at Victor. "Sir, show me your hands." "Right now." Victor ignored the guard. His eyes were locked on Arthur, sitting in the wheelchair at the end of the hall. "You're a hard man to kill, Pendleton," Victor yelled across the frozen ER, pulling his hand out from beneath his jacket. Isabella saw the glint of black metal under the fluorescent lights. A suppressed, heavy-caliber pistol. Before anyone could scream, before Officer Briggs could fire his taser, Arthur put 2 fingers to his mouth and let out a piercing, ear-splitting whistle. "Bruno, fass." The German word for attack tore through the air. Bruno didn't hesitate. The 90-pound K9 launched himself across the slick linoleum floor like a dark missile. He covered the 20 feet between himself and the stretcher in a fraction of a second. Victor raised the pistol, aiming wildly at the charging dog. But he was too late. Bruno leapt, his massive jaws opening wide. The dog hit Victor square in the chest, the sheer kinetic force of the impact launching the assassin backward off the stretcher and crashing violently into a row of metal waiting chairs. The heavy pistol clattered across the floor, spinning to a halt near the sliding glass doors. Screams finally erupted in the ER. Patients scattered, diving behind chairs and under tables. Dr. Miller scrambled backward into a supply closet, slamming the door shut. Isabella, however, didn't run. Driven by an adrenaline-fueled instinct she didn't know she possessed, she grabbed the heavy metal IV pole next to Arthur's wheelchair and stepped in front of him, wielding it like a spear. "Stand down, Isabella." Arthur coughed, spitting a fleck of blood onto the floor. Bruno's got him. Across the room, amidst the tangled mess of overturned chairs, Victor Sullivan was screaming. Bruno had pinned the man to the floor, his jaws locked vice-tight around Victor's right forearm. The dog wasn't thrashing or tearing. He was executing a perfect, paralyzing hold, applying exactly enough pressure to crush bone if the man moved a single inch. Victor swung his left fist, trying to punch the dog's head, but Bruno simply growled deeper, tightening his grip until a sickening crack echoed through the room, followed by Victor's agonizing howl. "Officer!" Arthur shouted over the chaos, his voice carrying undeniable authority. "Kick the weapon away and cuff him. He has a secondary knife in his left boot." Officer Briggs, shaking uncontrollably, holstered his taser, drew his actual firearm, and kicked the suppressed pistol across the room. He advanced cautiously on the writhing assassin. "Don't move. Hands behind your back." "Get this freak off me," Victor sobbed, his bravado entirely broken under the crushing jaws of the K9. Arthur slumped back into his wheelchair, his energy finally spent. The bleeding from his abdomen had soaked through the new bandages Isabella had applied. "Bruno. Os." Instantly, the dog released the man's arm. Bruno stepped back, panting lightly, but kept his eyes fixed on Victor as Officer Briggs slammed handcuffs onto the assassin's wrists. The immediate threat was neutralized, but the chaos was far from over. The ER doors slid open again, and this time, heavily armed Seattle police officers poured into the room, their weapons drawn, having finally responded to Dr. Miller's initial panic button press. Isabella dropped the IV pole. Her hands were shaking so violently she had to clench them into fists. She looked down at Arthur. The disabled SEAL's eyes were rolling back in his head, his breathing becoming shallow, rapid gasps. "Arthur, stay with me," Isabella yelled, dropping to her knees beside his chair. Bruno trotted quickly back down the hallway, ignoring the screaming police officers and the crying patients. He nudged his bloody muzzle under Arthur's dangling, limp hand, whining softly. Arthur managed a faint, bloody smile, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. "Good boy," he whispered. Then, Arthur Pendleton's eyes slid completely shut, the heart monitor attached to his finger letting out a long, continuous, terrifying tone. He was crashing. The continuous, flat-line shriek of the heart monitor sliced through the remaining chaos of the emergency room. Arthur Pendleton's head lolled to the side, his pulse completely gone. "He's in V-fib. Crash cart now." Isabella screamed, her previous fear instantly swallowed by years of ingrained trauma training. She grabbed the handles of the wheelchair and forcefully tipped it backward, essentially dumping the 220-pound Navy SEAL flat onto the tiled floor. It wasn't gentle, but you couldn't do effective CPR on a canvas wheelchair seat. Dr. Harrison Miller, finally emerging from his panic-induced retreat in the supply closet, sprinted over. His arrogant demeanor was entirely gone, replaced by the frantic, hyper-focused energy of a surgeon desperately trying to cheat death. "Jenkins, start compressions. Brenda, push 1 milligram of epinephrine." Miller barked. Dropping to his knees beside Arthur's blood-soaked torso, he grabbed a pair of trauma shears and began ripping away the remaining bandages. The bullet must have nicked the descending aorta, or the inferior vena cava. "He's bleeding out internally." Isabella locked her hands together, positioned the heel of her palm over Arthur's sternum, and began pushing hard and fast. 1, 2, 3, 4. The sickening crunch of cartilage echoed under her hands, a necessary brutality to keep the blood pumping to his brain. Around them, the Seattle police officers who had just swarmed the ER were shouting, trying to secure the perimeter. Officer Briggs was practically sitting on the moaning assassin, Victor Sullivan, while another officer ratcheted the handcuffs tighter. But a new threat emerged as 2 heavily armored SWAT officers pushed their way through the sliding doors, their assault rifles raised. Their eyes immediately locked onto the most obvious danger in the room, the 90-pound, blood-spattered German shepherd standing untethered near the coding patient. "Secure that dog," a sergeant yelled, leveling his rifle at Bruno. "Animal control is 10 minutes out. If he moves aggressively, put him down." Bruno, sensing the shift in aggression, turned his massive head toward the SWAT officers. He didn't bark, but he planted his front paws firmly in a defensive stance over Arthur's head, his lips pulling back to expose a terrifying array of white teeth. The K9 was doing exactly what he had been trained to do, Protect his handler at all costs, even if it meant taking a bullet. No! Stop! Isabella screamed, not breaking her rhythm on Arthur's chest. 15, 16, 17. He's a Federal Service K-9. He just saved our lives. Lady! Get out of the way. That dog is a lethal threat, the sergeant commanded, taking a step forward. The red dot of his rifle's laser sight danced across Bruno's dark mahogany chest. Bruno issued a low, rumbling growl that vibrated through the floorboards. He was a microsecond away from launching himself at the officer. Clear, Dr. Miller suddenly shouted, pressing the defibrillator paddles against Arthur's bloody chest. Isabella threw her hands up, falling backward. The electrical current violently jolted Arthur's massive frame, causing his entire body to arch off the linoleum. The monitor shrieked, then beeped once, then twice. "We have a rhythm," Brenda yelled from the portable monitor. "Heart rate is 45 and climbing. Blood pressure is in the basement, but he's back. We need him in operating room 1, right this second, or we lose him again," Miller said, his face dripping with sweat. He looked up at the SWAT sergeant, whose rifle was still trained on the dog. Dr. Miller, the man who had demanded Bruno be thrown out just 10 minutes earlier, stood up and stepped directly into the path of the laser sight, placing his own body between the police rifle and the German Shepherd. "Sergeant," Dr. Miller said, his voice deadly calm and dripping with absolute authority. "That man on the floor is an American hero, and that dog is his partner. If you shoot that animal, you'll have to shoot me first. Now get out of my way so I can save this man's life." The ER went dead silent again. The sergeant stared at the surgeon, then slowly lowered his rifle. "Get him out of here, Doc." "Jenkins, get the gurney," Miller yelled. Within seconds, orderlies hoisted Arthur onto the mobile bed. As they began sprinting down the hallway toward the surgical wing, Bruno didn't need to be told what to do. The K-9 fell into a perfect heel right beside the moving gurney, his nose occasionally bumping against Arthur's dangling hand. Isabella ran alongside them, squeezing a bag of O-negative blood to force it into Arthur's veins faster. She glanced down at Bruno. The dog was panting heavily now, the adrenaline wearing off, but his amber eyes were entirely focused on his master. Isabella realized then that Arthur Pendleton wasn't just a patient. He was the center of this dog's entire universe. As the surgical team crashed through the double doors of OR 1, Isabella stopped. "Bruno, stay," she commanded gently, unsure if the dog would listen to anyone but Arthur. To her surprise, Bruno stopped exactly at the red line painted on the floor, the sterile boundary. He sat down heavily, his tail wrapping around his paws. He let out a single, heartbreaking whine as the heavy metal doors swung shut, cutting him off from Arthur. Isabella knelt down, uncaring about the blood on her scrubs, and wrapped her arms around the dog's thick neck. Bruno leaned his heavy head into her shoulder, a silent gesture of trust that brought hot tears to Isabella's eyes. "I know, buddy," she whispered into his fur. "I know. They're going to fix him." 2 hours later, the ER had been transformed into an active crime scene. Yellow police tape was strung across Trauma Bay 3 and the waiting area where Victor Sullivan had been apprehended. Flashbulbs from crime scene investigators popped rhythmically, illuminating the pools of drying blood. Detective Ray Caldwell ducked under the police tape, a lukewarm cup of gas station coffee in his hand. Caldwell was a 20-year veteran of the Seattle Police Department's Major Crimes Unit. He was a perpetually tired-looking man with salt and pepper hair, wearing a rumpled trench coat that looked like it had survived the 1990s. He walked over to where Isabella was sitting on a bench near the triage desk. She had changed into clean scrubs, but she still looked pale and utterly exhausted. Bruno was lying faithfully at her feet, his eyes tracking every police officer that walked past. "Nurse Jenkins?" Caldwell asked, flashing his gold shield. "I'm Detective Caldwell. I know you've been through a meat grinder tonight, but I need to ask you a few questions. I've already told the patrol officers everything," Isabella said, her voice raspy. "I know, and I read their notes. But patrol cops look for the what. I'm looking for the why," Caldwell said, pulling up a rolling stool and sitting across from her. He glanced down at Bruno, visibly impressed. "That is one hell of a dog." Word around the precinct as he nearly took a hitman's arm off. "His name is Bruno." "And he did," Isabella said defensively, resting a hand on the dog's head. "You called the shooter a hitman," Caldwell noted, pulling out a battered notepad. Why? Because of the way Mr. Pendleton reacted, Isabella explained. Arthur knew who he was. He called him Victor Sullivan. He said Sullivan was the one who shot him earlier. Caldwell sighed, taking a sip of his terrible coffee. Your patient was right. We ran the guy's prints while the medics were setting his arm. Victor Sullivan is a known entity. He's a highly paid contractor, usually works out of Eastern Europe, but he has ties to the Volkov syndicate. Isabella frowned. Volkov? Like the Russian mob? Like the Russian mob, but with better lawyers and deeper pockets, Caldwell corrected. They run a massive smuggling operation through the port of Seattle. Drugs, weapons, human trafficking, you name it. They move it in shipping containers. But Sullivan isn't a street-level thug. He's a ghost. He gets paid 6 figures to make high-profile problems disappear. So, my question is, what makes a wheelchair-bound Navy SEAL down on his luck such a massive threat to a billionaire crime syndicate that they send their top closer to finish the job? Arthur said he fell on some rebar near the docks, Isabella recalled. But Dr. Miller found powder burns. He was shot at close range. Terminal 46, Caldwell said, tapping his pen against the notepad. We found Arthur's van parked 3 blocks from there. It's a restricted commercial loading zone controlled by a shell company owned by the Volkovs. Whatever Arthur was doing down there at 1 in the morning, he saw something he wasn't supposed to see. And whatever it was important enough that Sullivan followed him to a crowded hospital to silence him. Isabella shivered. Is Arthur going to be safe here? I've stationed 2 armed plainclothes officers outside his recovery room, Caldwell assured her. And Sullivan is currently handcuffed to a bed in the secure ward upstairs, guarded by SWAT. But to be perfectly honest with you, Nurse Jenkins, if the Volkovs want someone dead, they don't usually stop after the first attempt. Just then, the double doors to the surgical wing swung open. Dr. Miller walked out, peeling off his surgical cap. He looked completely drained. Isabella stood up immediately. Bruno was on his feet in a microsecond, his ears perked forward. Doctor? Isabella asked, holding her breath. Miller ran a hand over his face. It was close. The bullet fragmented upon entry. It tore through his ascending colon and nicked his liver. We had to resect a foot of his bowel and pack the liver to stop the hemorrhaging. He required 6 units of blood. But is he alive? Detective Caldwell asked bluntly. He's alive, Miller confirmed. He's tough as nails. We have him in the intensive care unit on the 3rd floor. He's sedated, but stable, though I have no idea how he managed to stay conscious long enough to get here in the first place. Bruno let out a loud, demanding bark, looking at Dr. Miller and then gesturing toward the elevator with his snout. Despite his exhaustion, Miller managed a faint smirk. Yes, I know. You want to see him. Nurse Jenkins, protocol dictates no animals in the ICU, but tonight, protocol can go to hell. Take the dog up to his room. Thank you, doctor, Isabella said, feeling a massive weight lift off her chest. I'm coming with you, Caldwell said, standing up. As soon as he wakes up, I need to know exactly what happened at Terminal 46. The ICU on the 3rd floor was quiet, a stark contrast to the war zone the ER had become. The lighting was dimmed, and the only sounds were the rhythmic pumping of ventilators and the soft beeping of monitors. Arthur Pendleton lay in room 312, surrounded by a complex web of IV lines and drainage tubes. His face was devoid of color, heavily bruised, and an oxygen mask covered his nose and mouth. As soon as Isabella opened the door, Bruno pushed past her. The massive dog trotted to the side of the bed and gently rested his chin on the mattress, right next to Arthur's motionless hand. Bruno let out a long sigh, his eyes closing briefly, as he finally felt the reassuring, albeit weak, pulse of his handler. Isabella checked the monitors, adjusting the flow of IV antibiotics. Detective Caldwell stood in the corner, his arms crossed, watching the sleeping SEAL. How long until he wakes up? Caldwell asked quietly. Hard to say. The anesthesia needs to wear off, and his body has been through immense trauma. It could be a few hours, or it could be tomorrow, Isabella replied, writing down the vitals on the chart. An hour passed in heavy silence. Isabella sat in a chair near the window, fighting to keep her eyes open. Outside, the Seattle rain continued to pour, washing the city streets in a blurry glow of amber streetlights. Suddenly, Arthur groaned. It was a weak, gravelly sound that vibrated through the oxygen mask. Bruno was instantly alert, standing up and pressing his nose against Arthur's cheek, whining softly. Arthur's eyelids fluttered, heavy with drugs and pain. He slowly opened them, wincing against the dim light. His eyes darted around the room, wild with panic for a split second before they landed on Bruno. The panic instantly subsided. Arthur weakly lifted a hand and buried his fingers in the thick fur on the back of Bruno's neck. "Hey, buddy," Arthur whispered, pulling the oxygen mask down slightly. "Arthur, don't try to move," Isabella said softly, stepping up to the bed. "You're in the ICU. You made it out of surgery." Arthur looked at Isabella, a faint smile touching his scarred lips. "Thanks, Doc." "Nurse," Isabella corrected with a small smile. "Mr. Pendleton," Detective Caldwell said, stepping out of the shadows. "I'm Detective Caldwell, SPD. I need to ask you some questions about what happened tonight." Arthur's demeanor changed instantly. The warmth vanished from his eyes, replaced by a cold, calculating military stare. "Are you clean, Detective?" Caldwell raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me? Are you clean?" Arthur repeated, his voice surprisingly firm despite his injuries. "Because half the badges down at the Port Authority are on the Volkov payroll. If I talk to you, how do I know my chart doesn't accidentally get pumped full of morphine in 10 minutes? I don't work for the Port Authority, and I sure as hell don't work for the Volkovs," Caldwell said, his tone turning hard. "I've been trying to nail those Russian bastards for 5 years, but I need evidence. Now Victor Sullivan doesn't shoot people for fun. He shoots them to protect the syndicate's assets. What did you see at Terminal 46? Arthur stared at the ceiling for a long moment, the only sound the rhythmic hiss-click of his monitors. Finally, he looked back at Caldwell. "I'm not just a retired SEAL," Arthur said quietly. "I work as a private contractor for a joint DOJ and DEA task force. We suspected the Volkovs were bringing in a massive shipment of weapons-grade fentanyl, hidden in car parts. But we couldn't get a warrant without proof. So you went rogue to get the proof," Caldwell deduced. "I didn't go rogue. I went in quietly. A guy in a wheelchair rolling around the docks looks like a lost homeless vet, not a federal spy. It's perfect camouflage," Arthur explained, wincing as a spasm of pain hit his abdomen. "I bypassed the security gate and got into the manifests office in Warehouse 7. I found the shipping logs. They aren't just moving fentanyl, they're moving VX nerve gas components, black market military hardware. Enough to equip a small army." Caldwell visibly paled. "Nerve gas? Are you certain?" "I copied the entire digital ledger," Arthur said. "But Sullivan caught me on my way out. He put a suppressed round in my gut. I managed to roll off the loading dock and hide in the storm drain while Bruno caused a distraction. I dragged myself back to my van, but I was bleeding out too fast to make it to the safe house. I had to come here." "Where is the digital ledger?" Caldwell demanded urgently. "If we have that ledger, we can raid Terminal 46 tonight before the shipment moves." Arthur smiled grimly. He tapped the thick, heavy-duty tactical collar around Bruno's neck. "Second patch on the left," Arthur whispered. "It's a false Velcro backing. The micro SD card is sewn inside." Isabella looked at the dog in sheer amazement. The dog hadn't just protected Arthur. He had been carrying the very evidence that could bring down a multi-billion-dollar crime syndicate. Caldwell immediately reached for Bruno's collar. A low, vibrating growl instantly erupted from Bruno's chest. The dog's amber eyes locked onto Caldwell, warning him to back off. "Bruno, lasses," Arthur commanded softly. "Let it go." Bruno stopped growling immediately, though his eyes never left the detective's hands. Caldwell carefully peeled back the second Velcro patch on the tactical harness. Hidden inside a tiny, waterproof sleeve was a black micro SD card. "I'll be damned," Caldwell breathed, holding the tiny plastic square like it was a live grenade. "I need to get this to the feds immediately. I'm calling in the FBI." "Wait," Arthur said, his voice suddenly thick with dread. He grabbed Caldwell's sleeve with surprising strength. "Sullivan. We have Sullivan in custody," Caldwell assured him. "He's heavily guarded." "You don't understand," Arthur rasped, his eyes widening. "Sullivan is a cleaner, but he never works a high-value asset alone. If the Volkovs are moving VX gas tonight, Sullivan would have had a backup team, a breach squad." Isabella felt a cold dread settle in the pit of her stomach. "What are you saying, Arthur?" "I'm saying," Arthur breathed heavily, "that if Sullivan hasn't checked in with his handlers to confirm I'm dead, The backup team isn't going to wait. They know I'm at this hospital. As if on cue, the lights in the ICU flickered once, then twice, and then, with a heavy, mechanical clunk that echoed through the entire hospital, the power grid completely failed. The room plunged into absolute darkness, illuminated only by the eerie, pulsing red glow of the backup battery lights on Arthur's medical monitors. The hum of the hospital's ventilation system died away, leaving an oppressive, terrifying silence in its wake. Down the hallway, Isabella heard the unmistakable sound of the stairwell doors crashing open, followed by the heavy, synchronized thud of tactical boots hitting the floor. "They're here," Arthur whispered in the dark. Bruno didn't growl. He didn't bark. The massive German shepherd silently moved away from the bed and positioned himself directly in front of the locked ICU door, disappearing completely into the shadows. The hunt had come to them, and the hospital was about to become a war zone. The suffocating darkness of the intensive care unit was pierced only by the rhythmic, crimson flashes of the emergency strobe lights in the corridor and the small, battery-powered LCD screens of Arthur's life support monitors. The air in room 312 felt instantly 10 degrees colder. The comforting hum of the hospital had been replaced by the terrifying, echoing silence of a besieged fortress. Detective Ray Caldwell didn't hesitate. He drew his SPD-issued Glock 19, the metallic slide racking around into the chamber with a sharp, unforgiving clack that sounded deafening in the quiet room. He immediately moved to the right side of the heavy wooden door, pressing his back against the wall to avoid the fatal funnel of the doorway. "Nurse Jenkins, get him off the wall monitors," Caldwell ordered in a harsh, hushed whisper. "Switch everything to battery power. We have to move him." Sitting in this bed makes him a static target. Isabella's hands were shaking violently, but her muscle memory took over. She reached up, blindly feeling for the power cords, and ripped them from the wall sockets. The ventilator and the IV pumps beeped angrily before seamlessly transitioning to their internal battery reserves. "I can't move the whole bed quietly," Isabella whispered back, her voice trembling. "It's too heavy, and the wheels squeak. The wheelchair." Arthur grunted from the mattress. He reached down, his fingers gripping the bed rail with white-knuckled intensity. The pain of moving with a freshly resected bowel and a packed liver was unimaginable, but adrenaline was a hell of a drug. "Get me in the chair, Arthur. You'll tear your internal sutures," Isabella protested, horrified. "You could bleed out in minutes. If I stay in this bed, I bleed out anyway," Arthur replied, his voice a ragged edge of pure determination. "Do it." Isabella grabbed the heavy canvas wheelchair that had been parked in the corner of the room and quickly wheeled it flush against the bed. With Caldwell keeping his weapon trained on the door, Isabella locked her arms under Arthur's shoulders. Biting down on a groan that threatened to become a scream, the disabled Navy SEAL shifted his weight, dragging his battered body off the mattress and collapsing heavily into the canvas seat. Isabella swiftly unhooked his portable IV bags and hung them on the chair's metal backrest. Thud, thud, thud. The heavy, synchronized footsteps in the hallway were getting closer. They were tactical, deliberate. There was no shouting, no panicked running. This was a professional breach squad moving in standard stack formation. "They have night vision," Arthur whispered, staring into the dark corner of the room. "They cut the power to blind the security cameras and the local cops. Caldwell, they can see your body heat. The moment you step into that hallway, you're dead." "I have to hold the door," Caldwell muttered, sweat beading on his forehead. "I've got one spare magazine. That's 31 rounds. I can hold them off long enough for SWAT to clear the stairwells." "No," Arthur said. He let out a low, sharp whistle, followed by a whispered command. "Bruno, Shatton, Shadow." In the crimson glow of the emergency lights, Isabella watched something truly terrifying. The massive, 90-pound German shepherd didn't just move. He seemed to dissolve. Bruno flattened his belly to the cold linoleum, crawling completely under Arthur's vacated hospital bed. The heavy blankets draped over the sides concealed him perfectly. He made no sound. He wasn't panting. He was a coiled spring of lethal intent, waiting in the exact spot the assassins would look last. Outside the door, the footsteps stopped. A heavy silence stretched for 3 agonizing seconds. Then, the doorknob slowly, silently began to turn. Caldwell raised his Glock, centering the tritium night sights on the wooden paneling. The door burst open. A man dressed in full black tactical gear, wearing a heavy Kevlar vest and four-lensed panoramic night vision goggles, swept into the room. He held a suppressed, compact submachine gun tightly against his shoulder. His head snapped toward the bed, seeing the crumpled, empty sheets. Before the point man could register that his target was sitting in the corner, Arthur clicked his tongue. It was a tiny sound, but to Bruno, it was a thunderclap. The German Shepherd exploded from beneath the hospital bed. He didn't bark. He didn't go for the heavily armored torso or the protected neck. Bruno launched himself low, his massive jaws snapping shut with bone-crushing force directly onto the back of the mercenary's right knee, the unprotected joint. The sickening snap of ligaments tearing echoed through the room. The point man let out a muffled shriek of agony, his leg collapsing backward under the dog's sheer kinetic force and ripping teeth. As the man went down, his fingers squeezed the trigger in panic. Pruft, pruft, pruft. Suppressed gunfire tore through the ceiling tiles, raining fiberglass and drywall dust down onto Isabella and Arthur. Caldwell didn't waste the opening. He leaned around the doorway and fired 3 deafening, unsuppressed shots down the hallway at the remaining mercenaries in the stack. Bang, bang, bang. The roar of the 9mm rounds in the confined space was absolute chaos. Screams erupted from the corridor as Caldwell's cover fire forced the hit squad to scramble backward behind the nurse's station for cover. "Bruno, higher," Arthur commanded. The dog instantly released the writhing man on the floor and bolted back to Arthur's side, sitting firmly next to the wheelchair, his muzzle covered in fresh blood. Caldwell kicked the dropped submachine gun out into the hallway and slammed the heavy wooden door shut, locking it. "That bought us maybe 60 seconds. We can't stay here. They'll wall-bang the room." "The reinforced drug lockup," Isabella blurted out, her ears ringing violently from the gunshots. "It's 30 feet down the hall to the left. Solid steel door, no windows. If we can get inside, they can't breach it without C4. 30 feet is a mile when they have automatic weapons," Caldwell said grimly, ejecting his magazine in the dark to check his round count by feel, then slamming it back in. "We go fast, and we stay low," Arthur said, his breathing shallow and rapid. The exertion was taking its toll. Blood was already beginning to seep through his hospital gown. "Isabella, you push the chair. Keep your head behind the backrest. Detective, you're on point. Bruno will cover the rear. Let's move." Caldwell pressed his hand against the door handle. "On 3, 1, 2, 3. He yanked the door open and threw himself into the corridor, dropping to one knee. He immediately fired 2 suppressive rounds toward the shattered remains of the nurse's station, where the green lasers of the mercenaries' rifles were sweeping the darkness. "Go! Go!" Caldwell roared over the gunfire. Isabella slammed her weight into the back of Arthur's wheelchair. The heavy canvas chair lurched forward out of the room, the small front wheels protesting as they hit the threshold. The corridor was a nightmare landscape illuminated only by the frantic, pulsing red emergency strobes. The air tasted of copper and burnt cordite. Pfuft, pfuft, smack. Suppressed rounds chewed into the drywall just inches from Isabella's head, showering her scrubs in white plaster dust. She ducked her chin to her chest, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, and pushed with every ounce of strength she had. "Keep moving," Arthur yelled, his voice strained. He reached down to his right side, pressing a bloody hand hard against his surgical wound to keep his insides from tearing completely apart. Bruno was a dark blur at their heels. He moved with practiced tactical spacing, constantly checking the rear, his amber eyes scanning the darkness for any flanking threats. They passed room 314, then room 316. The heavy steel door of the pharmacy lockup was just 10 feet away. Suddenly, a massive figure stepped out from the intersecting stairwell corridor, cutting off their path. It was another mercenary. He had flanked Caldwell's suppressive fire. The man raised his weapon, the green laser sight painting a bright, lethal line directly onto Isabella's chest. Time seemed to slow down. Isabella froze, her hands gripping the rubber handles of the wheelchair. She stared into the dark, featureless lenses of the man's night vision goggles. She knew, with absolute certainty, she was about to die. But Arthur Pendleton was not a man who let the people protecting him die. With a roar of pure, agonizing effort that tore his remaining internal stitches wide open, Arthur planted his feet on the footrests and lunged his upper body forward. He threw his left arm backward, forcefully knocking Isabella out from behind the wheelchair. Isabella hit the linoleum hard, sliding across the slick floor as a suppressed round passed exactly through the empty space where her chest had been a millisecond before. But Arthur was completely exposed. Before the mercenary could adjust his aim to finish the wounded seal, a streak of black and mahogany intercepted him. Bruno didn't wait for a command. Seeing the direct threat to his master, the K9 launched himself into the air. But the mercenary was quick. He swung his rifle like a bat, striking the dog mid-air. The heavy polymer stock collided with Bruno's ribs with a sickening crack. The K9 let out a sharp yelp of pain, his trajectory thrown off, and he crashed into a medical cart, sending sterile supplies scattering into the dark. "Bruno!" Arthur screamed, his voice raw with panic. The mercenary quickly raised his rifle again, aiming at the crumpled dog. Bang! Bang! Two deafening shots echoed from the other end of the hall. The mercenary's head snapped back violently, his night vision goggles shattering into plastic shrapnel. He collapsed onto the floor like a puppet with its strings cut. Caldwell stepped forward through the smoke, his Glock smoking. "Get to the door." "Now." Isabella scrambled to her feet, ignoring the bruising pain in her hip. She grabbed the wheelchair and shoved it the final few feet to the heavy steel door of the pharmacy lockup. She frantically swiped her bloody ID badge over the battery-powered proximity reader. The light blinked green. A heavy magnetic lock disengaged with a thunk. Isabella shoved the door open, practically throwing Arthur's wheelchair inside. Caldwell backed in right after them, his weapon still raised, sweeping the dark hallway. "Bruno," Arthur choked out, refusing to let Isabella pull him fully into the room. "I'm not leaving him." Out in the corridor, under the pulsing red lights, Bruno was struggling. The blow to his ribs had severely injured him. The massive dog was panting heavily, his front paws scrambling on the slick floor as he tried to drag himself toward Arthur. "I've got him," Caldwell said, holstering his weapon. He sprinted out into the exposed hallway, grabbed the heavy tactical harness on the dog's back, and hauled the 90-pound animal up. A fresh hail of suppressed gunfire erupted from the nurse's station, chewing up the doorframe as Caldwell dove backward into the lockup, dragging Bruno with him. Isabella slammed the heavy steel door shut and threw the manual deadbolt. The sudden, absolute silence inside the reinforced room was deafening. They were safe. But as Isabella turned on her phone's flashlight, casting a stark white beam across the small, windowless room, the reality of their situation hit her. Arthur was slumped unconscious in his wheelchair, a massive pool of fresh, dark red blood expanding rapidly across his lap. And on the floor next to him, Bruno was lying on his side, his breathing rapid and shallow, a soft, heartbreaking whine escaping his bloody muzzle. "Arthur! No, 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 stay with me," Isabella cried, dropping to her knees beside the wheelchair. She frantically searched the shelves of the pharmacy lockup, grabbing trauma dressings, pressure bandages, and anything she could use to pack the catastrophic bleed. Caldwell knelt beside Bruno, gently running his hands over the dog's ribcage. "He's got broken ribs, maybe internal bleeding. He took a massive hit, Isabella. I can't lose them." Isabella sobbed, her hands slick with Arthur's blood as she applied desperate, heavy pressure to his abdomen. "Arthur, you stubborn bastard. Don't you dare die on me now." For 20 agonizing minutes, they sat in the cold, claustrophobic darkness of the drug lockup. Isabella fought a desperate, bloody battle to keep Arthur's blood pressure from completely bottoming out, while Caldwell sat with Bruno's massive head resting in his lap, softly whispering praises to the injured K9. Then, the floor vibrated. It wasn't footsteps. It was the heavy, unmistakable rhythmic thud of rotor blades slicing through the Seattle storm. A helicopter was hovering right outside the hospital. A moment later, the muffled sound of a massive explosion echoed through the concrete walls, followed by the rapid, staccato crack-crack-crack of unsuppressed, heavy-caliber military rifles. "That's not the hit squad," Caldwell said, his eyes widening. "That's the FBI hostage rescue team. They breached the roof." The ensuing firefight lasted less than 5 minutes. The professional, surgical violence of the federal tactical teams completely overwhelmed the remaining Volkov mercenaries. Suddenly, heavy fists pounded against the steel door of the lockup. "Seattle Police, FBI, identify yourselves." A muffled, authoritative voice boomed through the steel. "Detective Ray Caldwell." "SPD." Caldwell shouted back, scrambling to unbolt the door. "I have a critically wounded civilian and an injured K9. We need a trauma team in here right now." When the heavy door swung open, the hallway was flooded with the blinding white lights of tactical flashlights. The backup power had finally been restored, and the overhead fluorescents flickered back to life, revealing a corridor that looked like a war zone. Medical personnel, escorted by heavily armed SWAT officers, flooded into the tiny pharmacy room. Isabella was shoved aside as Dr. Miller, looking bruised and covered in dust, but miraculously unharmed, rushed in with a crash cart. He blew his internal sutures. Isabella babbled, her hands shaking uncontrollably as she stared at the blood coating her arms. "I held pressure, but he lost so much volume. You did good, Jenkins." "We've got him," Miller said, his voice surprisingly gentle as orderlies hoisted Arthur back onto a mobile stretcher. "Get him down to OR 2 now. Push 2 units of whole blood en route." As they wheeled Arthur out, Isabella turned her attention to the floor. "The dog. We need a vet." A tactical medic, wearing a heavy Kevlar helmet, knelt next to Bruno. He pulled out a specialized K9 trauma kit. "I've got him, ma'am. I'm a certified handler medic. Let's get aboard and stabilize his spine." "He's a tough boy, aren't you, buddy?" Bruno let out a soft huff, his amber eyes tracking Arthur's stretcher until it disappeared around the corner. Only then did the massive German shepherd finally close his eyes and allow the medics to work. Caldwell walked over to Isabella, who was leaning against the steel shelving, completely drained. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the tiny, waterproof sleeve containing the micro SD card. "I'm heading to the mobile command center downstairs," Caldwell said, his face hard with determination. "I'm handing this over to the Bureau. By dawn, the FBI will be kicking down the doors at Terminal 46, and the Volkov Syndicate is going to burn." He looked at Isabella, his tired eyes softening. "You saved his life tonight, Nurse Jenkins." "Twice." Isabella managed a weak, exhausted smile. "No, Detective." Bruno did. The afternoon sun broke through the eternal Seattle overcast, casting a warm, golden glow over the green lawns of the city's largest dog park. Isabella Jenkins, dressed in civilian clothes and holding 2 steaming cups of coffee, walked down the paved path. Up ahead, sitting on a wooden bench, was a man in a wheelchair. He looked different now. The heavy bags under his eyes were gone, and the pale, ghostly pallor of near death had been replaced by a healthy, sun-kissed complexion. Arthur Pendleton smiled as Isabella approached. "You're late, Nurse Jenkins," he teased, his voice still holding that familiar, gravelly edge. "Traffic on I-5 was a nightmare." Isabella laughed, handing him a coffee. "How was physical therapy?" "Torture," Arthur grunted. "But the doctors say I might be able to transition to a cane by Christmas." "And where is the hero of the hour?" Isabella asked, looking around the park. Arthur whistled a soft, gentle note, vastly different from the sharp, tactical commands of that terrifying night. From across the grassy field, a massive black and mahogany German shepherd came bounding toward them. He moved with a slight, barely noticeable limp in his back leg, but his energy was boundless. He wore a new tactical harness, but this one was bright blue, adorned with a shining silver medal clipped securely to the collar, a civilian commendation for extraordinary bravery. Bruno trotted up to Isabella and shoved his heavy wet nose directly into her hand, demanding scratches. "Hey, buddy," Isabella whispered, kneeling down and burying her face in his thick fur, just as she had done on the worst night of their lives. Arthur watched them, taking a slow sip of his coffee. The Volkov Syndicate had been completely dismantled. Victor Sullivan was facing life in a supermax prison, and Terminal 46 had been shut down permanently. It had taken blood, terror, and a standoff that would be whispered about in the halls of Seattle General for decades. But sitting there in the sun, watching the woman who saved him play with the dog who protected him, Arthur finally felt something he hadn't felt since leaving the Navy. Peace. What an absolute roller coaster. From a desperate plea in a chaotic midnight ER to a terrifying blackout shootout, Arthur and Bruno proved that the bond between a veteran and his K9 is stronger than any hit squad. Isabella's quick thinking and unshakable bravery under fire highlight the true, unsung heroism of our frontline medical workers. When the system failed, a nurse, a disabled SEAL, a gritty detective, and one unbelievably courageous German shepherd held the line against insurmountable odds. If this intense, pulse-pounding story of loyalty, survival, and the unbreakable bond between man and dog kept you on the edge of your seat, please hit that like button. Share this video with your friends, family, and every dog lover you know. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more incredible, gripping, true-to-life stories just like this one. See you in the next video.